Okay, meine Damen und Herren, ich bin nicht David Archer, mein Name ist Kai-Olaf Maywald. Ich werde jetzt diesen neuen thematischen Block moderieren, in dem es um normative Haltung gegenüber Kindern und gegenüber der Kindheit geht. Wir werden es genauso machen wie in den Sitzungen davor. Das heißt, wir werden zuerst die Vorträge haben und dann eine Diskussion. Ich werde jetzt kurz die Vortragenden der Reihe nach vorstellen. Da ist zunächst David Archer. David Archer ist Moralphilosoph, der gegenwärtig an der Queen's University in Belfast lehrt. Vorher war er an der Lancaster University. Er hat eine ganze Reihe von sehr unterschiedlichen Forschungsschwerpunkten, aber ein ganz wichtiger Forschungsschwerpunkt ist die Ethik der Familie, die er in vielen Publikationen und bezogen auf viele Detailphänomene und Probleme bearbeitet hat. Der zweite Vortragende ist Ferdinand Sutterlüti. Ferdinand Sutterlüti ist Professor für Soziologie hier an der Goethe-Universität mit dem Schwerpunkt Familie und Jugend. Man sollte aber auch sagen, dass er einen wichtigen Schwerpunkt im Bereich der Gewalt- und Konfliktforschung hat. Ferdinand Sutterlüti ist langjähriges Mitglied im Kollegium des Instituts für Sozialforschung und leitet, das hat Herr Hornert ja eingangs schon gesagt, das Forschungsprojekt Paradoxien des Kindeswohls, zu dem er dann auch vortragen wird. Sarah Mühlbauer ist Soziologin und Mitarbeiterin in diesem Forschungsprojekt und wird auch in diesem Themenbereich promovieren. So. Mr. Archer, the floor is for you.
So, one thanks and two apologies. First, a thank you for the Institute for inviting me here to Frankfurt. Two apologies. First, I am sorry to speak only in English. Secondly, since you have been talking about democracy, I apologize for British democracy. At the moment, it is like Chagall's great painting. It's a circus, but it is not beautiful. It's ridiculous and rather tragic. But I want to talk about the concept of childhood and some paradoxes. And these have arisen from some recent writing on children and childhood in moral and political philosophy. So let me start with a well-known quotation from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Humanity has its place in the order of things. Childhood has its in the order of human life. The man must be considered in the man and the child in the child. And that quotation is seen as the first by any philosopher to draw attention to the positive value of children and childhood, which otherwise was considered only negatively by contrast with adulthood. And recent writing on childhood has demanded that we recognize what is distinctively different and special about this stage of human life. And I'm thinking here of writing by Anke Ghosh, Sam Brennan, Colin MacLeod, who have drawn attention to what they've called the intrinsic goods of childhood. Now, that writing was principally motivated, and in the first instance, by concerns in distributive justice, and particularly theories of justice that draw on John Rawls, theories that talk about the goods, the social goods that need to be distributed by society. And one thought is that there is a very adult-centered concern with goods, and we need to take account of what is owed to children in terms of their goods. But it's also led to a debate in recent years about the value of childhood, and more particularly the comparative value of childhood against adulthood. What is it that makes childhood, by contrast with adulthood valuable. And it has been stressed that the value in question is intrinsic. It's the value in itself of childhood. So not instrumental value, not the value of childhood as a means to or a preparation for adulthood. Childhood is not only valuable insofar as it gets us on the road to adulthood, nor is the value in question external, that is the value to other people. So we may enjoy children, but that's not the value of childhood to the child. And the writing has insisted that the value of childhood has to be understood in terms of particular dispositions, outlooks, motives, and beliefs. And it has further been argued only children can enjoy what it is that makes childhood valuable. Here are some of the candidates, some of the suggestions as to what makes childhood valuable. Innocence, curiosity, what Harry Brighouse and Adam Swift have called carefreeness, a lack of seriousness, and others have talked about a certain imaginative freedom. It's interesting, I think, to note that these are dispositions or attitudes rather than goods, although some social goods now become particularly valuable, most obviously play, so that if you think that imagination, curiosity are particular dispositions of children, then play has a value for children that it may not have for adults. And here's the paradox. If we can evaluate childhood on its own terms as different from adulthood, then we should be able to compare childhood and adulthood, and now a paradox does appear. If childhood is on balance more valuable than adulthood, then why not remain forever a child? Why become an adult? And I hope you know the tale of Peter Pan. I've written a note on Peter Pan because most people badly misunderstand the original play. It's not an innocent play at all if you read it carefully. It's about sex and death. And that was Barrie's concern with childhood. Peter Pan is not a great hero. He's a tragic person who avoids what he should face up to, namely adulthood. But take Peter Pan as a metaphor for childhood forever. If childhood is more valuable than being an adult, then why shouldn't we stay forever in childhood? If, on the other hand, adulthood is more valuable than childhood, then why wouldn't it be better to be born a fully developed person? Or why wouldn't we dramatically shorten the period of childhood? And if we could do so genetically, why not think that it would be best to be born as old people rather than as young? And there is one obvious literary representation which people may know, the short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Strange Tale of Benjamin Button, which was then made into a film. Benjamin Button is born an old man, and rather than getting older, just gets younger and dies as a baby. So the paradox is, what might make childhood distinctly and particularly valuable might also make it a state that one would be better off not being in or never having been in. So that's the first paradox. How might we reply? Well, one thing that's been said is childhood is only valuable to a child. It's not valuable to an adult. But that misses the point, because even if that's true, it doesn't mean that we can't offer an evaluation of a whole life in which we can imagine different periods of childhood and adulthood, and such that we can say a human life might be better or worse off if it lacked a childhood. A second kind of reply to this paradox is to say we simply cannot measure childhood against adulthood. They are so distinct that their values are, as philosophers say, incommensurable. We cannot measure them in the same terms. That claim has been made by an English philosopher, Patrick Tomlin. That response seems evidently far too strong, especially if you think that human lives are continuous and without dramatic breaks between childhood and adulthood. Moreover, incommensurability doesn't mean incomparability. So that we cannot measure the value of childhood or adulthood doesn't mean that we can't compare them and say that one is better or worse than the other. We can compare, even if we do it only in very rough, imprecise terms, or in simple better or worse terms. We can compare lives with different balances of adulthood and childhood. A better response to the paradox is to say childhood is not so much a state of being as a stage of a human life. It's a point in the development of a human life, and that's how it must be understood and evaluated. And that means that its value is, in part, relational. It has to be understood in terms of how it stands to other stages, its relationship to other stages of human life. So for some, childhood is important and significant because it is essentially a preparation for adulthood. It's what we have to go through in order to become adults. Dan Weinstock, a Canadian philosopher, has argued as much. And his particular argument is this: in childhood, a human being practices or experiments or rehearses various ways of living and various roles and parts. And those rehearsals, those experiments, are what is necessary to building up a character, a nature, and an identity. You are the adult you are because of the way in which you went through this rehearsal of childhood. So one cannot be a fully developed adult agent, someone who can independently think, believe, and want certain things, and do so in your own terms. You can only be such an adult if you went through a kind of learning or apprenticeship of immaturity as a child. But now I fear there's yet another paradox. Namely, if the value of childhood is as a preparation for adulthood or a precondition of adulthood, then we're back to the old view which I started with and which Rousseau objected to, namely that childhood is only valuable for what it leads to, namely adulthood. It's not valuable in itself. It has no real importance other than as being what is needed to develop beyond it. And there's a still further puzzle. And that is why childhood has to take the particular form it does. And why, taking the particular form it does, it exposes the human being to certain risks of unrepairable and egregious harms. And I want to say a bit more why. There are a number of writers in American and English philosophy who have characterized childhood as a predicament. It's a dangerous situation in which you find yourself. Indeed, those who talk about the predicament, people like David Velleman, for instance, think that the very fact of being brought into existence is to throw you into a predicament. And that is one of extreme vulnerability and dependence on others. The young child, the infant, is above all else open to risks of harm and to failures on the part of others to care for them. And that's led some to say childhood is not only not good, it's very bad. And here is one more paradox. Those very dispositions that are supposed to make childhood valuable, whether in themselves or for how they prepare us for adulthood, expose the child to risks of serious harm. So Sarah Hannon has a nice pair of arguments in this respect. She thinks childhood is bad on balance. Why celebrate innocence? Innocence is not knowing. And it's actually very bad not to know certain things, because only by knowing certain things can you avoid them. If you're innocent, you don't see the dangers that threaten. If you're curious and innocent, then you increase the risk of being harmed. Thus, says Sarah Hannon, childhood is not a good state of affairs, not a good stage of human life, but extremely bad for children. So, I want to make some concluding comments, but suggest that there's one more set of paradoxes that are in store for you. It does seem to me true that the only appropriate way to understand, give a value to childhood, is from within the perspective of a whole human life. That's how you must start to think about childhood, namely the part it plays within a whole life, and in particular, the shape that that life takes, the form it takes. A very influential account of human life is as a narrative, as an unfolding story with a succession of chapters, the last one of which is old age and death. I myself don't favor that view. All I want to insist is that a human life is understood in terms of a shape, even if that shape is not properly thought of as a story or a narrative. A human life is a kind of temporal unfolding. It is something that happens across time, and it's significant that childhood is at the very beginning. That is, that it's at the outset of a human life and before everything else. And that, and here comes the paradox, opens up interesting comparisons with old age. I used to write about children, now I'm old, I write about old age. And old age is often thought of as the second childishness of human beings. And if you recognize that quotation, it's because it's from Shakespeare, and it's the famous 7 Ages of Man, which is a description of the different stages we go through, and where we end up is famously, says Shakespeare, in a second childishness, sans teeth, without everything. But then there are yet more paradoxes, because what supposedly shouldn't matter is your age. Ageism is discriminating wrongly against people on the basis of their age. And you shouldn't take account of people's age. But I think you should, because it matters when things happen to you in your life, whether they occur earlier or later. And there are particular problems of what can happen to you when you're old that are very different from those same problems if they occur earlier in your life. But that's another paradox and another talk. So thank you.